My name is Steve Bromley. I am a games user researcher. Today I want to introduce a theme that I'm very enthusiastic about. How do we make sure that players understand, enjoy and can play our games throughout development? I'll give a little bit of my background to start off with. So, as I mentioned, I'm a games user researcher. I've worked in the games industry for over a decade now. First 5 years of my career, I was based at PlayStation in their European user research team. PlayStation was a nice place to learn how to do games user research and how to do playtesting because you get exposed to a huge variety of team sizes. Both have very big studios who work on AAA games, and also through their extra program working with very small studios. And from this, you see a huge variety of approaches you can take to playtest, huge variety of approaches for games user research, and some of the challenges that different teams have. I'm also a very active member of the games user research and UX community. I started the mentoring program for the IGDA's special interest group on this and have been on the steering committee from time to time. And now I work with game teams to help them run playtests, get user research set up in their production process, and that's partly what we've talked about today. I've had the opportunity to work on a lot of games. The easier ones to talk about are the ones from PlayStation. So, as I mentioned, big ones like Horizon Zero Dawn, and smaller teams with different challenges, such as their beta titles like Big Fest or Murasaki Baby. I wrote a book on games user research called How to Be a Games User Researcher. I made a kit explaining how to do playtesting for your own game. And the book inspired some conversations I've been having with game teams and partly what we'll be covering today, which brings me to the theme for today. First, I want to talk about the risks to successful game development. What are some of the challenges that you will encounter when you're developing your game? Some of the reasons why your playtesting might not be as effective as you're hoping it to be or as you believe it should be. How do we work out what to playtest and when, and how do we apply that user research best practice to run higher quality playtests? And last of all, effective playtesting, how to make the best use of the time that you're spending with players when you're running your user research or your playtest sessions. But let's start at the beginning. Let's talk about how games user research de-risks development. Now, I'm sure everyone on the call understands that game development is risky. Every day, hundreds of games are released to Steam, and the vast majority of games that end up on Steam end up selling less than 100 copies. That's obviously not sustainable, and the vast majority of studios end up folding after releasing their first game because they're not reaching the level of commercial success they expect to. Obviously, that's inherent in the nature of games. Games are a difficult mixture of creativity and business, where to find what's fun and to work out where the fun is in games requires experimentation, exploration, and that's in contrast to what business needs. Business needs certainty and deadlines, and bringing these things together can be a big challenge. And when you think about it, there are usually three types of risk that games suffer from, or three reasons why your game might not be successful. The first is production risk. Can the team actually make this game? And producers put a lot of effort into mitigating that through iterative development practices, prototyping, defining their hypotheses about what they think will work, or creating a shared vision across the team about what the game is and what we're making so that they're effective at making it. The second risk, market risk. Will anyone buy this game once we make it? And market researchers and marketing does a lot of work to calculate the market size, understanding the purchase behavior of players, starting building community and starting marketing throughout development to try and mitigate that market risk. The type of risk I'm most interested in, and our focus for today, is this third type of risk, experience risk. Once you make the game and there's a market for it, will players actually like it? Will players actually understand it? And if this is critical. If you're making a game that players don't understand or don't enjoy, you're going to get poor retention. People will drop out of playing your game. You'll get poor word of mouth around your game. You'll see poor reviews. You won't get wish lists. All these problems. And that's what we, through applying playtesting and user research techniques want to address. Luckily, this has been part of game development for as long as game development has existed. Way back in the 1970s, Atari was employing someone called Carol Kunter to go around to different arcades, watch how people are playing the arcade games, and see where they're getting confused or where they're getting stuck, what usability issues that they're encountering. And ever since then, playtesting, that idea of putting players in front of your game and seeing what they understand or what they think or what they like or don't like, has been a recognised part of how playtesting and game development works. It allows you to see what players do, allows you to see what players think, and that creates more opportunity for iteration. I spend a lot of time talking to game developers about playtesting and their approaches, and what I hear when I talk to them about these conversations, I hear some red flags that make me think there's issues with how many game studios are approaching playtesting. And it's these red flags that we're going to talk about today and have some strategies on how to address them. The first thing we'll talk about in the second half of this presentation is the challenges and the risks of playtesting with the wrong players. The second one is running your playtesting too late, so you're not syncing it with the game development and game design decisions that you have to make. The third one we'll talk about is using inappropriate methods and getting the wrong kind of data back from your playtest so that you can't use it. And the last one is not approaching it with that unbiased mindset, not being able to ask unbiased questions or analysing the data in a way that introduces bias into your approach. We'll talk about how to address all of these, but when studios don't address these, essentially you're not de-risking those player experience issues. As a consequence, playtesting feels pointless, it feels like it's not being a reliable return on time investment, and it falls down that list of development priorities. And I see that all the time. When game teams talk to me about the issues they're having with playtesting or the issues they're having with user research, they will say things like, well, it's just telling us stuff we already know. And again, there are techniques that we'll talk about to mitigate that and to make sure that you are learning new and interesting things from your playtests. We also see the impact of that on production. Not having that reliable playtesting cadence set up throughout your development can help make issues worse. Issues such as shifting priorities and chaotic changes to your development roadmap, last-minute changes and crunch, the team not having that shared awareness of what are we trying to make or where we're going and creating things that aren't quite correct. Essentially, that all adds up to rework, teams having to make something and then make some changes to and redo previous work they've done to help address to help make sure they're making the right thing. This is where games user research and the work that we do in the user research field steps in. We look at the risks with playtesting, we look at why it's not landing, we look at why it's not useful, we look at why it's not giving an appropriate return on investment, and we apply elements of the scientific process, a knowledge of appropriate study designs, of ethics, and work out how to get reliable data at the right point to draw sensible game design conclusions and mitigate many of those risks. And what we're going to talk about today isn't necessarily rocket science, although a lot of people working in games user researchers might have postgraduate degrees, expensive qualifications, letters after their names. This isn't required. Really, what a professional games user researcher will bring when you work with them is experience of dealing with different situations and knowing how to proceed, the time and focus to do this correctly, without conflicting demands on their time from other development priorities, and the spirit of neutrality. We're after the truth, not what's convenient for game development. And none of that requires those expensive qualifications or courses or background academic expertise to achieve. With time, experience, an open mindset, and that spirit of genuinely trying to find player experience issues, you can do this yourself. If you don't have time, obviously there are ways you can outsource this, and you can work with a dedicated user researcher or an agency to free up your time elsewhere. but a lot of the principles are things that you can apply whether you're a producer, a community manager, a UX designer, regardless of your background. So the second thing I wanted to talk about was what should we be playtesting and when should that happen? And one of the major risks we'll talk about in the second half of this presentation is what happened when that's left too late and some of the problems with that. Now, you might be familiar with a typical game development timeline. Obviously, it's different in different studios. It might have different names or have different deliverables at each stage of this. But this process, as described by Richard Lemarchand in his book, A Playful Production Process, gives the vague shape of what teams are doing. They go through some ideation at the beginning to work out what they could be building and explore some different ideas. There's pre-production, where you'll build a vertical slice, something that represents here is the core idea of our game, and check that core game loop lands. There's production, where the vast majority of the actual content of the game is built, cranking out levels, models, art, all the things that actually go into the final game. And then there's a post-production phase where we're polishing and preparing the game for release. And the type of research that should be running and the type of playtesting you can be doing differs at different stages of this. In that initial ideation, in fact, we'll go into this in more depth in a second, but in ideation, the type of playtest we should be running and the type of things we want to learn from playtests are different from what we want to learn in post-production or post-launch. I will share a link at the end if you want to get a copy of this checklist so that you can follow it along without having to write it down. So during ideation, as I'm sure you're familiar, the point from a team's perspective, they're trying to discover one or more ideas that could be a game, and then think about how players will experience it and work out, is this fun? Can we build a game off this idea? As from a playtest and research perspective, the type of studies that we'll often be running are defining who the players are, so working out actually what is the context of play, where are people going to be playing this game, what constraints, design constraints that introduce, and being aware of that. We might be testing those individual interactions that are coming up through ideation to see which ones players find fun or which ones are interesting. And also there's a lot of value here to understand competitor games. You can learn a lot about how to implement something by how other teams have implemented it or other approaches used elsewhere. And so understanding what's working and failing with competitor games adds a lot of value here. During pre-production, teams are building out their favourite ideas and validating that if you put these ideas together, you can make a full game before they decide to ramp that up to a larger development team, a larger burn rate, and take that into full production. And again, as with playtesting, we can both look at each of those systems in isolation, make sure that players understand the mechanics of the game, and that they can do it, and that they are fun, but also at this stage, test that core game loop. When you've put all those mechanics together, does it come together as a fun experience that players will enjoy? And this vertical slice stage, again, is a very valuable place to validate with players before you take that into a full production where changes become a lot more expensive and a lot more difficult to make. During production, obviously the team is building the game at that point, trying to minimize scope changes or rework. And by the end of production, they hope to have a complete experience that, while buggy, while not polished, is a candidate for launch. You could release this as a game. And again, with players, the things we're looking at to do at this time is testing the breadth of that content, making sure players understand it, making sure that players can do it for every level, for every section, for every mechanic in the game, making sure that there's not any bumps to the player experience that will start to lose players if we do that. Also, playtesting and user research can help prioritize development. When priorities do shift, or there's the argument that we should be changing the focus of the game, again, regularly getting insight from players, regular pulse checks to look at that complete experience will help prioritize what's important for the game and help prioritize the scope of the game and steer those development decisions with data. In that post-production phase, teams are looking at polishing, removing bugs, don't know, increasing the quality of the art, doing little polish things, and removing any remaining player pain points. Again, playtesting, very valuable at this stage. When you've got this complete experience, we want to start balancing the difficulty and the pace of the game, running larger quantitative studies to ease out any difficulty spikes or ease out any bits that are slow or boring, and do that through large measurement-based studies. Also, if any usability issues are still popping up here after production, this is a good time to catch it and address those issues. Lastly, these days, especially with live service games, the launch isn't the end of development, and there will be the desire to add new content, to maintain and grow a live game. And playtesting can help here too. It can help you optimize retention, so making sure that you aren't losing players on day 1 or day 7 or day 14 of the game. Again, particularly useful for things like free-to-play games where a lot of the optimization happens after launch. And also it helps you decide what to work on next. Helps you prioritize new content, new priorities, work out what you're going to do in the sequel through that game through seeing how players are actually experiencing your game post-launch. And as I mentioned, this complete production process for the game development is available as a checklist after. There's a link at the end of this talk. One of the ethoses, though, that I wanted to get across in this first half is we should always be starting with what decisions do teams need to know today? What are you as a producer or a designer or a solo developer? What decisions are you making? Is it what is the core mechanics of this game? Is it polishing to what's fun? Is it working out where you should be prioritizing the scope of your game? And then use that to decide what approach to use. Use that to inspire when we should be running playtests. And we'll talk about a practical approach for doing that in a minute. But that type of thinking about the objectives, what we want to learn from the study, should be informing how you're going to run the study. Once you've worked out what are the questions we have, what do we want to know from players, you can then start thinking about how we're going to run those playtests. So in the second half of what I wanted to cover today, I want to talk about how do we actually do that, and what does effective testing look like, and what can you do in your own studio to help integrate better practice into how you're approaching this. And this is based on conversations with game developers. As I mentioned, I have a lot of conversations with different people who are running playtests as part of their role. That includes solo developers, designers, producers, community managers, QA people, UX designers, a lot of people who are not dedicated user researchers, but do have to run a playtest as part of their role. And I talk to them about what's difficult, what are the challenges they have that stop them running playtests, and some of the approaches that we've explored to improve that and fix that for them. And the first challenge that teams come to me with is getting the right players. Now, as I mentioned, I have those conversations and talk to teams about how are you finding playtesters currently, how are you recruiting? And some regular themes come up. People say, oh, I ask my friends and family to playtest and tell me what they think. They might have partnerships with their university game development courses, and so they get game dev students in to playtest the game. If they're lucky, they might have an existing community, and they ask that community to play through the game and play through an upcoming version of the game and give feedback. Or they might be really relying on playtesting or game developer communities. Things like Reddit's r/playtesting forum or Reddit's r/game dev community, or Discords where playtesters and game devs share feedback on each other's games are some typical places that teams are going to find players. Unfortunately, this does introduce a number of risks. All of these groups aren't particularly representative of the people who are actually going to be playing your game and the vast majority of your audience at launch. For one thing, their prior knowledge is going to be different. The type of things that they know about your game or that their expectations about the game are going to be different because they are professional game developers, or because they are your existing community, or because they are your friends. They're not like the typical player who will end up buying your game. And that's going to impact their opinions, that's going to impact their behavior, and ultimately the type of data you'll get back from this group will be different. They don't really represent the real behavior or opinions of your genuine players, and that will start to introduce risk. Again, making your playtest less valuable, tell you things that aren't actually helpful or representative, and reduce that return on investment of playtesting. The principle we want to get across here is you are not your players. We, whether we are game developers, whether we are your friends or family, we are fundamentally different from our players. If we come into it with an already understanding how the game works, it's also impossible for us to channel that beginner's mindset. We won't know what is that real experience of a real player coming in for the first time unless we're putting the effort into sourcing those real players. So, how do we find those real players? The first thing we need to think about is defining who our players are. You can't have sensible conversations about who are we making this game for without first thinking about writing down our understanding of who our players are. And you might have seen things before that would be described as personas from a marketing perspective. Things where they say, hey, here's our player's demographic, or here's a little bio about our player's background, and things they like and they don't like. Well, usually these aren't that helpful. They're a bit fictional. They're usually based on people's assumptions about who their players are, or some sort of large quant data sets that are aggregated. And the type of things that we're capturing here aren't actually useful for inspiring game design decisions. Things like they don't like bugs and they hate loading times are obvious. Everyone hates bugs, everyone hates loading times. And there's nothing in these type of fluffy personas that actually will help you as a game developer make game design decisions. That doesn't mean the exercise is bad, though. It just means we need to be very specific about what we want to learn when we are defining our players. And there are categories of things that you can think about, that you can capture about players, that will actually change what game design decisions you make, and also where we're going to find players. There are things like understanding why they abandoned games in the past, or what are they expecting out of games like this, or what other games they've played, or where to find them, where they'll be online, or where are they when they're playing, how long is a play session for them. All these things you can imagine do have concrete decisions on game design decisions. They'll influence what we need to explain to players, what situations we need to support in our game, what are the opportunities to impress them or to avoid losing them. Obviously, at this stage, you won't know these answers because we haven't seen any players. However, starting by running a workshop internally to capture everyone's assumptions about this, and then learning and iterating your understanding of your player over time by adding a few questions every time you're playtesting people, can start to reveal really interesting and relevant game design data that we can use to inspire who is our players and get that definition down. Once you've got that definition, you can use it to inspire where are we going to find our playtesters. You can either work with an external recruiter to find those players for you once you've given them a specification of who your players are and where they'll be and what they'll look like. They can accurately find those. Or you can use it to find those players in the wild and invite them to take part in your playtests. We don't really have enough time to go into the methodology for doing that in depth, but there's a free video course on gamesuserresearch.com called Find Your First 100 Playtesters, which describes an approach where you've defined your players, you've worked out where they hang out online, and then you go and find their existing communities, and you create an offer that will compel them to join into your playtests, and it will guide you step by step through that. Once you have that definition, then it will improve the quality of your playtests. You can use it to screen your playtests, by which when you invite people to playtest, check whether they match the correct definition of your player, or check whether they are inappropriate, someone who wouldn't actually play your game in real life or wouldn't buy your game in real life. And because of that, you can then eliminate those people's data from your playtest, or treat that data differently and be more confident that the data that you're getting back is more representative of real players' opinions and real players' behavior from your game. Ultimately, this effort to find the right players and find the right playtesters does take some time, although there are ways to optimize that. Or if you have budget, you can outsource it, as I mentioned, with the recruiters. However, making sure that we are getting the right players into our playtest will increase how much we trust the data gathered and make sure that we're getting the most value we can from those playtest sessions. So, a second challenge with playtesting. Playtesting at the right time. And again, as I mentioned, I spend a lot of time talking to developers about when they playtest and what triggers them to decide to run a playtest. And many teams talk about syncing that with development milestones. So when they hit alpha, or when they hit a vertical slice, or when they hit beta, deciding this is when we're going to run our playtest, and run a big bundled up playtest at that point, which wants to learn everything about the current state of the game. I understand why that happens. It can be difficult to get builds together outside of those milestones. It's hard to prioritize playtesting when other development tasks are happening. You might have concerns that the game isn't in a good enough state to playtest, but it does introduce risk. The longer that we leave learning problems, the less ability we have to react to them. Especially as games are often very complex, very interdependent systems, it can be impossible to make changes once to a system once you've built another system on top of it. Thinking of a simple example, for example, in a platforming game like Mario, once you've started building levels, you can't really change how Mario's jump works because all the levels were tuned for jumping. And so if you don't learn problems with the jump until too late, you're stuck with it because you'd have to remake all your levels, again creating rework, creating risk. The longer you leave learning problems with your game, the more expensive it is to fix it. It's much cheaper to fix an idea than it is to redo all your levels in your game. And the fewer options you have to resolve it, often leading to quite clunky fixes to the problems and introducing more risk that your game won't be fun, won't be understandable to players. So how do we move away from that? It requires a mindset shift beyond thinking that playtesting is a thing that happened when you hit milestones, and instead recognizing that playtesting should be a way of validating or inspiring decisions. The first step of that is recognizing that whenever you are making a decision in your game, you have an assumption about what players will think, or what players will do, or what players will understand. And we should be encouraging our teams to articulate that. Whenever they come up with an idea, such as, well, the story's going to be a murder mystery, or I've put a big red weak spot on the middle of this enemy, or I've created a menu system for the inventory in this game, we need to recognize that has some assumptions about what players are going to do, what players are going to understand, and how players are going to approach that, and describe those hypotheses, describe what we think players will do, what we think players will understand, what we think players will be approaching in the game. And from that, you can create a backlog of assumptions about players' behavior. Obviously, games require hundreds, if not thousands, of decisions to make, and so you can't test all of those. Instead, the second step, once you've thought about what are our assumptions about players' behavior, is ranking the risk of that. Some of those systems and some of those decisions are more important than other ones. For example, if they're a core part of the experience, if they're a core system, if they are jumping in Mario, which the whole game is built around, that is quite important to validate and test. Whereas a secondary system, such as something buried deep in the menus that we don't really expect players to do, isn't as important to test. We also need to think about, are we actually able to make changes? If we did learn there were problems, can we do something about it, or are we stuck with it? Because again, if you're going to be stuck with it, that's going to deprioritize testing. We also have to recognize that our colleagues in design are experts in their field, and there's some things that they have done tens or hundreds of times before that is less important to playtest because we've done it so many times, we're confident we can do this again. Whereas there's other ideas that are risky, not done before, untested, that are more important to playtest because we're just not so confident with it. By asking yourself these type of questions about each of your hypotheses about players' behaviour, you can prioritise the list of things we need to test and work out what's critical to playtest immediately and what we should be running at the playtest on today, versus what's not that important, and if we left it until a big milestone test, it would be okay. And from that, rank what you need to be playtesting when. So I guess the ethos of this section is, rather than doing those big playtests that want to learn everything at their milestones, more successful teams are looking towards smaller playtests synced with when they're making high-risk decisions. Because they're using those high-risk decisions to inspire when the playtests run, that means that they can have very tightly defined research objectives. They're very clear what they want to learn from that playtest, and so it's actually going to be useful. It means it can be run at a time when the conclusions are still relevant. It's not too late, and actually we can act on the findings. And it also means that we can ignore the bits that aren't ready yet. Because we're only running a playtest that cares about jumping, just the fact that half the levels aren't in isn't a problem. We can either help players, we can step in with them. If we're in the room with a player, we can step in and we can help them overcome bugs or deal with less stable builds. So, for example, skipping through sections or helping them overcome bugs. And that won't matter. It won't matter that you're stepping in and helping them with the bugs or helping them skip sections, because that's not what we're trying to learn. We're trying to learn things about those high-risk decisions, and we don't mind that we're helping with the bugs instead, because that's less important. Often, as we'll see in the next section, you can get huge game development value just by showing your game to 5 players at the right time, rather than waiting until it's too late to show it to hundreds of players, but you can't react then, it's too late to react. So the third theme I want to talk about in this final section is about picking the right methods for your playtests. And again, going back to those conversations I have with game teams and game developers about their playtesting process, I asked them how are they normally running their playtests. And I heard a lot of enthusiasm for methods I'll describe as hands-off methods. They'll put the game available on Steam Playtest, for example, and then have a survey to see what players think, or create a Discord channel where players can give their feedback about what they think about the game. And again, I understand why teams default to this. When you're busy, when you have conflicting priorities, it feels very easy to send out a big survey or get people to fill things on Discord. It feels quite hands-off, and it feels like, oh, that can just work in the background while I'm doing other things. However, as a user researcher, again, we see some red flags with this approach. These methods are picked because they're convenient, but they're over-indexing on self-reported data. We're only getting from those surveys and from those Discords issues that players can tell us themselves and issues that players are comfortable telling us themselves. There's endless other potential types of data that we're just not getting from doing that. Because we're not watching players, we can't see what their behaviour in the game is, actually what they did in the game. If they missed something entirely, we won't be able to tell that because the player doesn't know that, so they can't tell us, so we won't know if they missed it or not. Other things they didn't understand, if the player doesn't realise they didn't understand it, they can't tell you these problems. You can't see what happened earlier in the session either. You're only getting their feedback at the end of the play session. So you can't see, did they see the twist coming, or why did they get stuck on that puzzle, rather than just hearing that they did get stuck on that puzzle. All that kind of granular detail that you would need to actually fix some of these playtest issues that are coming back, you're missing when you're relying on just surveys and Discord feedback. Instead, there's a whole bunch of research methods out there that you could be using to run your playtests. Live observation, so bringing players in either in person or doing it over a call on Zoom where you're watching players play your game, is tremendously valuable. We'll talk more about that in a second. Pre-recorded observation, often using unmoderated research tools like Playtest Cloud or Antidote, where you upload a build and you get videos back of people playing the game. Surveys, as we talked about a little bit. Interviews, actually talking to players live and asking them questions, which allow you to go deeper on some of the feedback. Or analytics in the game, where the game itself is tracking players' behavior and what's happening, are some of the methods you could be applying in your playtests. And picking the right method, as we talked about briefly earlier, should be based on actually what do we want to learn rather than what's convenient. Some of the things you might want to learn are measurement questions, like how many players do this, or how do players rate a section of the game. And then a survey is appropriate, because a survey is good for measurement. Other things you might want to understand why things are happening, or what players are doing in the game, their behavior, such as can players complete this level, can players get through this puzzle, how do players approach this section. You can only get that data through observation. Watching people play, either live or through pre-recorded video, is the only way to see their behavior. But even that won't give a complete understanding of why players are doing that. You might see that players did miss an objective or did go the wrong way, but to understand why they missed the objective, you need to ask some questions to see what's going on in their head, which often means that a combination of these methods, combining observation of people playing and then asking them some questions about it, is usually the most comprehensive and the most valuable way to approach your playtests. For most teams, though, I think they tremendously undervalue the value they would get from just watching a few people play and see what they do. You might have seen from that there's a concept in the usability of websites where they ran a big meta study looking at how many problems we find from how many users, and they came to the conclusion that, I mean, after about 5 or 6 test users, you've seen most of the problems, and it's probably good value then just to stop after those 5 and 6 players, fix those problems you've seen, and then retest again after to see if we fix the issues correctly, rather than keep learning those same problems again and again by going up to 12, 15, 50 users who are just going to learn the same problems again and again. Rather than doing larger studies to size those problems or see how many times they occur, you get more value for money by running more quantity of smaller studies and doing iteration, fixing the problems you're seeing, and then retesting. And one of the most valuable research objectives, one of the things where teams get the most value, is that objective at the top there of, I just want to find what bits in my game that people get stuck on or don't understand. And from 6, 10 players, you can usually find most of the problems that are high priority, that players will get stuck on and don't understand, fix them, and then put additional effort into retesting rather than just finding those problems again and again. So my ethos in this section is we should be picking the right method for our objectives, rather than just defaulting to running a survey or defaulting to getting Discord feedback. Even reasonably small observational studies where you're putting players in front of your game and you're just watching them play will provide a lot richer data, get you data you can trust. And because it is richer and has that detail to it, it allows you to actually action what you're learning. You've got the detail you need to fix the problems as they occur. So the last thing I want to cover before I think we do have a little bit of time for questions is approaching analysis. And as I'm sure you appreciate, playtests can gather a lot of data. Depending on your method, you might have observations about what players have done in the game. You might have some telemetry where the game itself has tracked what's happening. You might have some survey ratings. You might have some comments that the players have written. You might have some interview data, questions you asked them and answers they gave you. And that can be overwhelming for teams. And teams often end up looking at the easiest or self-reported data, or ignoring bits that they don't agree with or are difficult to find the nuance within, which is my point there. To address that, we need to be returning to those hypotheses. We need to be, when we start analysis, looking back at actually what is the decision that we made, what was our assumptions about players' behaviour, and then from that, what data from this playtest or this study will help us answer: can players do what we expect them to do? Are they acting in the way which we appreciate? And done properly, your study design should be inspired by your hypothesis. We haven't had a huge amount of time to deal with that today, but again, I'll give some advice at the end on where to read more. I guess one of the main principles to get across about analysis is treating what players did, behavioural data, which is reasonably objective because players definitely did go the wrong way or they definitely didn't understand something, from opinion data, what players say about the game or what they think about it, is more subjective and should be treated differently. Again, we don't have time to go into detail on how to approach that today, but assuming that we're recognizing and treating the data appropriately, revising the hypotheses that we're trying to answer, and giving analysis enough time as some of the principles to make sure that we are unbiased with our analysis, we are approaching it from a neutral perspective. And that does take time, but it does also mean that you're revealing things that you didn't know, things that are highly relevant to what you're working on currently, and essentially improving the return on investment from your playtest so that you are getting more value from that and it's not wasting the time and doesn't feel like a less of a priority. So those were a lot of the themes I wanted to talk about today. Some tools to help, and I'll give a link to all of these things after. There is a process for running playtests, some steps you need to go through and some steps to think about when you're preparing it to make sure that you are unbiased and you are approaching it appropriately. I'll give a link. So at the bottom there it says gamesuserresearch.com. Signing up will give you a link to how to approach this playtest process and some guides on how to do it. I also shared earlier that guide on what research you should be running throughout development. And again, on gamesuserresearch.com, if you sign up, you can find this type of thing, which is what I'll leave you with. So at the website, you'll find how-to guides for running different parts of playtesting. I mentioned earlier that course to find your first 100 playtesters is there free. Also, shortly there's a new free book that coming out there called Playtest Plus, which will describe how to run each of these different types of playtests and some approach to doing it. But also, I'm just happy to help. I'm really happy to answer your playtest questions, either now through the chat, or if you have playtesting questions in general, do just drop me an email. My email address is there, or you'll find me on gamesuserresearch.com. I'll be really happy to answer playtest questions, help you work out how to integrate it into your process, and make sure you're getting valuable from player insight throughout development. Thank you very much for the invite to talk today and for giving me your time. I will stick around if there are any questions, but regardless, thank you very much, and do email some questions after if they occur to you later. Thank you. A challenge I have if there are questions, I don't think I can see them. I think the host has them. Here we are.
Yes. I have some questions. 1 minute. How do I find players on a budget? It's first question.
I think that's a great question and a very common challenge for game teams, especially smaller game teams. They're very budget constrained and it's very difficult to do some of this. I usually find the biggest expense for game teams is finding players. Obviously, if you do have budget, that's usually the first place I'd recommend spending it, to outsource that, get a recruiter to go and find your players and bring them to you. And for many teams who have little or no budget, they can't use an external recruiter, and so they have to find their own playtesters. The approach for that, I guess it takes time instead of money. Just requires more time. And I mentioned it briefly earlier, but concept that I recommend is working out who your playtesters are and where they hang out, and then working out what you can offer them to take part in your playtest that isn't money. Obviously, some things you might be able to offer include recognition. You might be able to give them a credit in your game, say thank you for playtesting, and some people value that. You might be able to, something that I know a few studios do, is partner with other game studios and offer keys for each other's games as an incentive to take part. But work out what you can give for free to encourage people to take part in your playtests is important. So yeah, I think that's the first piece of advice is find other free ways to encourage people to take part in your playtests rather than having to pay for them would be the approach to playtesting on a budget. As I mentioned, there is that video course that goes through the steps of that on gameuserresearch.com. If that's okay. Thank you.
Second question: where are the most important playtests to run?
Which are the most important? Yeah. I'll go back to a picture if that's all right. So there are lots of times you could be running playtests, and obviously as a person who loves playtesting, I'd say, oh, you should do all of these. In real life, I know you have to prioritize. If you had to pick some, I would put a lot of focus at this vertical slice stage in the pre-production when you've made something that represents your game, but before you've gone into full production to build a huge team and to build it. When you're in production, it's very expensive to make changes. You've got a lot of people cranking out content. It's very hard to steer the ship at that point. So I think getting players in front of your game during that pre-production vertical slice stage will save you a whole bunch of stress of having to change priority late or money of having to change priority late. So I think there at pre-production, I would also look at throughout production when you've got significant new systems coming on, like you've got your tutorials and you're teaching how the games work. That's probably good times as well. So small usability test throughout production and a big test at pre-production is where it starts. But yes, all of these are valuable. Thank you.
How do I handle data from playtests?
Yes, that's a big question. So from your playtests, you're going to get a mixture of different things. You're going to get some things that players say about your game. You're going to get some observations, some things that you saw or that objectively happened. And those are different. There's objective data, things that definitely happened, and there's subjective data, like players' opinions about your game. For the objective data, it's easier to deal with because you know there definitely is a problem because it happened and it's objectively true that this happened. For that, I would go through a prioritization process of working out what are the most important things to deal with. And we didn't go today, but thinking about how many players this will affect, whether players can overcome it or whether they can't overcome it, there's another one, whether it's with a core system or not, will help you work out what are the biggest problems that we've seen behaviourally and add those backlogs to decide to fix. So yes, there's the objective things. For the subjective things, the opinions that players have about your game, I recommend an additional step. You need to be reflecting on what is your creative vision of the game and whether what you're hearing from players matches your creative vision for the game. For example, if you're working on a game like Dark Souls or Bloodborne, players will be telling you this is hard. That might be okay. If your creative vision of the game is it's meant to be hard, then you shouldn't make it easier just because you're hearing it from players. Instead, you need to be consciously deciding, do I want players to feel this is hard or do I not want them to feel it's hard? And so I guess my would be don't necessarily act directly on players' opinions. Understand why they're giving that opinions and give it some serious thought, but don't defer decision making to players for their opinions. In contrast to behavioural data, which you definitely should be acting on. I could talk for a whole hour about this, but I'll stop there for the time being.
And thank you. When should I playtest?
When?
When? Yes. When should I playtest?
Yeah. I guess it can always be valuable, and as we talked about in the talk, teams can often leave it too late. So I would be making sure that we're trying to do it as early as possible. One of the ethoses that I want to get across is actually when you should play test should be synced to decisions that you're making about your game. If you're making a significant decision about your game that is going to have a big impact on players, that's probably when you should be thinking about playtesting to make sure that players understand what you're doing and that you're getting the reaction you want. So I guess my short answer is when you make big decisions about your game, think this is the time to playtest.
Okay. Thank you so much for this stream, and I'm very nice to meet you.
I thank you so much for hosting and picking up your time today. If you or anyone else ever has any questions about playtesting, as I mentioned, my email address is here. I love talking about playtesting, so do get in touch. Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks.
Bye.